If you're new here, you're probably starting to notice something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The loss of control never begins with catastrophe. It begins with permission, quiet permission, invisible permission, and if you've been here before, you already understand this channel is not built for comfort. It's for people slowly separating themselves from emotional slavery, impulse-driven behavior, and the psychological manipulation hidden inside modern life. Turn on subtitles. Some things in this video need to be read slowly to fully land. Because the most dangerous impulses in your life are not the obvious ones. It's not the screaming anger. Not the public humiliation. Not the addiction everyone can see. It's the impulse that looks harmless. The extra 5 minutes. The unnecessary reply. The late night scrolling. The need to check if someone texted back. The tiny lie you tell yourself before doing the thing you promised you wouldn't do again. That's where self-destruction actually starts. Quietly. Most people think losing control is dramatic. They imagine a ruined life, a public collapse, some visible disaster everyone witnesses at once. But real psychological collapse is almost invisible in the beginning. It happens privately, gradually, through repetition so small your mind stops registering it as danger. That's why so many intelligent people destroy themselves while believing they're still in control. Because the human mind has a terrifying ability to normalize its own weakness. You see it everywhere once you notice it. A man says he wants discipline, but reaches for his phone within seconds of discomfort. A woman says she wants peace, but constantly returns to emotional chaos because calm feels unfamiliar. Someone says they want freedom while obeying every craving their nervous system throws at them. And eventually, something disturbing happens. Their impulses stop feeling separate from their identity. That's the hidden cost. At first, you feel like someone struggling against bad habits. Then slowly, you become the habit. The impulse starts speaking in your voice. You call it personality. You call it stress. You call it, just how I am. But what's actually happening is much darker. Your mind is being trained to obey immediate emotional relief over long-term truth. And the worst part, modern life rewards this. Every platform profits from your lack of control. Every distraction competes for your nervous system. Every notification trains your brain to become more reactive, less sovereign, less capable of stillness. People think control is about avoiding extreme behavior. No, real control begins in the milliseconds before action. The pause, the interruption, the moment where your mind says, "Do it," and another part of you quietly watches. Most people never strengthen that observer. That's why they become predictable. Predictable people are easy to manipulate. A person ruled by impulse can always be controlled through emotion. Fear controls them. Validation controls them. Lust controls them. Attention controls them. Anger controls them. And because they never learn to sit inside discomfort without obeying it, their entire personality becomes reaction-based. You've probably already felt this happening before. You open an app without deciding to. Reach for food without hunger. Check someone's profile without intention. Replay an argument in your head long after it ended. Imagine revenge. Imagine validation. Imagine being seen, admired, desired. Not because you consciously chose to. Because your nervous system became addicted to stimulation. And once stimulation becomes identity, silence starts feeling threatening. That's why some people cannot sit alone in a room without reaching for something. Music, content, messages, noise, anything to avoid contact with themselves. Because underneath constant impulse is usually something much older. Restlessness, shame, emptiness, fear. But people rarely face that layer directly. They distract themselves instead. And distraction is dangerous because it feels harmless while slowly removing your ability to confront reality. A distracted person can waste years without noticing. That's not an exaggeration. Years. One impulse at a time. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow. You tell yourself this one moment doesn't matter. You tell yourself you deserve relief. But repeated relief becomes dependency. Then dependency becomes identity. And identity is powerful because the brain protects whatever it believes you are. Read that carefully. Once your mind accepts, "I'm just lazy, I'm just emotional, I'm just impulsive," your behavior starts defending the label automatically. That's why change feels violent to some people. Not physically, psychologically. Because discipline threatens the identity their nervous system became attached to. People say they want transformation. But transformation requires the death of familiar impulses. And most people are more loyal to familiarity than truth, even when familiarity is destroying them. There's a reason ancient Stoics obsessed over self-observation. Not because they wanted to become emotionless. Because they understood something modern society forgot. A man who cannot govern himself will eventually be governed by everything around him. By trends, by moods, by public opinion, by desire, by fear, by appetite. You can see it in people's eyes now. Shortened attention, constant agitation, mental fragmentation. Most people cannot even finish their own thoughts anymore without interruption. Their minds are overcrowded, and an overcrowded mind loses authority over itself. That's why small impulses matter more than dramatic ones. The dramatic moment is usually just accumulated weakness finally becoming visible. The real battle happened long before anyone noticed. In private, alone, at night, in the moments nobody applauds. That's where identities are formed. Not during motivation, not during inspiration, during resistance. When you don't feel like doing the thing. When nobody would know if you stopped. When your body asks for comfort and your mind quietly says, no. That moment changes you more than people realize. Because every resisted impulse strengthens internal authority. And every obeyed impulse weakens it. This is why people who constantly chase comfort slowly lose presence. You can feel it around them. They become mentally soft, easily shaken, emotionally dependent, desperate for stimulation, not because they're unintelligent, because their nervous system stopped tolerating resistance. And once resistance disappears, dignity usually follows. Look carefully at modern behavior patterns. People cannot wait anymore, cannot focus, cannot endure silence, cannot regulate emotion, cannot delay gratification. Everything must happen instantly. Instant entertainment, instant validation, instant pleasure, instant escape. But the nervous system pays a price for every impulse it obeys. And eventually the bill arrives psychologically. You see it as anxiety without clarity, exhaustion without labor, emptiness without understanding why. Because the mind loses trust in itself when it repeatedly watches itself break its own promises. That sentence alone explains more suffering than most people realize. Your self-respect is not built through thoughts. It's built through evidence. Tiny evidence. The alarm rings. You get up. You say you'll stop. You stop. You promise yourself discipline. You follow through. That's how identity changes. Not through motivational speeches. Through repeated proof. But most people unknowingly train the opposite. They become experts at self-betrayal. And self-betrayal creates internal weakness no amount of confidence can fully hide. You can hear it in the way people speak. Over-explaining. Seeking approval. Performing certainty. Pretending confidence. Because internally, they know something feels unstable. Why? Because they stopped trusting themselves privately. The world focuses heavily on external reputation. But internal reputation matters more. What your mind believes about you determines how you move through reality. If your mind sees you as weak, inconsistent, emotionally reactive, undisciplined, it changes your posture toward life itself. You hesitate more, avoid difficulty more, need reassurance more, seek escape faster. Not because life became harder. Because you became easier to control. That's the hidden tragedy of impulsive living. You slowly lose authorship over your own behavior. And most people don't notice until consequences become irreversible. The damaged relationship, the wasted years, the destroyed health, the scattered attention span, the lost ambition, the inability to focus deeply, the emotional dependence they once mocked in others. It rarely happens overnight. It happens gradually enough for denial to survive. That's why the strongest people you'll ever meet usually move differently around impulse. Calmer, slower, more deliberate, not because they don't feel temptation. Because they stopped romanticizing obedience to every feeling. That changes everything. A sovereign mind understands something emotional people never fully grasp. Feelings are real, but they are not commands. You do not have to obey every emotion your body produces. Anger can appear without becoming action. Desire can appear without becoming behavior. Fear can appear without becoming retreat. But modern culture teaches the opposite. It teaches emotional obedience disguised as authenticity. Just feel. Just express yourself. Just do what feels right. No, some feelings are signals, some are distortions, some are withdrawal symptoms from dependence you haven't identified yet. And if you never learn the difference, you spend your life reacting instead of choosing. That's why impulse control is deeper than productivity. It's spiritual, because every impulse asks the same hidden question. Who governs your mind? You, or your conditioning? That question becomes terrifying once you sit with it honestly. Because many people eventually realize most of their life was reaction. Reaction to loneliness, reaction to rejection, reaction to insecurity, reaction to boredom, reaction to craving, not conscious living, reaction. And reaction-based living creates fragile people. People who need the world arranged perfectly just to remain emotionally stable. But reality doesn't negotiate with emotional dependency. Eventually life removes comfort, removes certainty, removes people, removes routines, and in those moments, your level of internal control becomes visible immediately. This is why some people collapse under pressure while others become sharper. Pressure reveals who trained their mind before the crisis arrived. The dangerous part is that many impulses don't look destructive initially. They look normal, even socially accepted, especially the need for constant stimulation. That one silently destroys millions of minds. A brain trained to consume endless stimulation loses its ability to generate depth. It becomes passive, reactive, dependent on novelty. You can watch this happen in real time now. People scroll while eating, scroll while walking, scroll while talking, scroll while watching something else. Their minds are never fully present anywhere. And presence is impossible without control over impulse. That's why many people feel emotionally numb now. Not because they feel too little. Because they feel too much, too often, without processing any of it fully. The nervous system becomes overloaded. And overloaded systems seek escape. That's where compulsive behavior grows strongest. Not from evil, from exhaustion. But exhaustion unmanaged becomes identity too. You start saying, "This is just who I am." No, that's who repeated impulses trained you to become. There's a difference, and that difference changes everything once you see it clearly. If this video is exposing something you've quietly recognized in yourself, press like. Not for the algorithm alone, but as a private acknowledgement that you're becoming more aware of the patterns controlling modern behavior. And in the comments, write, "I choose awareness." Not as performance, as a decision. Because awareness is where sovereignty begins. Most people never even reach that stage. They stay unconscious long enough for their impulses to completely redesign their personality. And the terrifying part is, society often rewards them before it punishes them. Impulsive people can appear exciting at first. Emotionally reactive people can appear passionate. Attention-addicted people can appear socially successful. For a while. But beneath all of it is instability. And instability always collects interest over time. Eventually the emotional crashes arrive. The inability to focus arrives. The fractured relationships arrive. The inability to be alone arrives. Then one day, silence exposes everything distraction was hiding. And that moment changes people forever. Some wake up, others run back to noise immediately. Because silence forces confrontation. Not with the world, with yourself. There is a point most people reach without noticing it. Not a dramatic breaking point. A quiet one. A moment where they realize they are no longer deciding things, they are simply responding to them. And by the time that realization appears, the pattern has usually already settled deep. You don't feel it as loss of control at first. You feel it as convenience. You tell yourself you're just taking a break. Just checking something quickly. Just escaping for a few minutes. But something subtle shifts in those moments. You stop initiating your life and start reacting to it. That shift is almost invisible from the inside. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. You still wake up. You still function. You still talk about goals, plans, ideas. But internally, your attention no longer belongs to you. It gets pulled. And anything that can pull your attention without resistance, eventually shapes your identity. Think about that carefully. Because attention is not passive. It is ownership. What you repeatedly attend to becomes what you repeatedly become. Most people never realize they are being trained by their own impulses. Not once, not twice, but thousands of small repetitions every day. And the mind learns quickly. Faster than discipline. Faster than intention. Faster than logic. A man once believes he controls his evenings. But after enough repetition, the evening begins to control him. Same time, same patterns, same triggers, same escape routes. It stops feeling like a decision. It starts feeling like, just how the day ends. That phrase alone is a warning sign. Just how it is. Because nothing becomes just how it is, without being practiced. There is a psychological threshold where behavior stops feeling optional. That is where identity begins to harden. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine a man who promises himself he will stop something at night. Scrolling, overthinking, escaping into noise. The first night, he resists for a few minutes. The second night, less. The third night, he doesn't even try fully. Not because he forgot his intention. Because his nervous system already learned the shortcut to relief. And relief always feels more urgent than intention in the moment. That is the mechanism most people underestimate. You are not competing with logic. You are competing with relief. And relief always feels honest. It feels like truth in the body. But it is often just familiarity disguised as necessity. Now here is where it becomes more serious. Every time you obey impulse, you strengthen its authority. Every time you resist it, you weaken its claim over you. But most people experience this in reverse emotionally. Resisting feels painful, obeying feels relieving, so the mind begins to associate weakness with comfort and discipline with discomfort. That inversion quietly reshapes a life. There is a reason certain people seem unusually steady. Not because their impulses are weaker, but because their response to impulses is trained. They don't negotiate internally. They observe, pause, and decide. That pause is everything, but modern life is engineered to remove that pause. Speed replaces reflection, stimulation replaces silence, reaction replaces choice, and a reactive mind cannot build depth. Only motion. There is a man I want you to picture clearly. Not as fiction, but as a pattern repeated across millions of lives. He wakes up slightly tired. Not exhausted, just slightly off. The first impulse appears almost immediately. Check something, anything, messages, updates, noise. He tells himself it is harmless. But what he is really doing is confirming he is not required to face stillness. That avoidance becomes the first decision of the day. And the first decision quietly sets the tone for all the rest. Because a mind that begins the day avoiding discomfort rarely reverses direction later. It only accelerates in the same direction. He works, but his attention fractures easily. He eats, but barely tastes anything. He talks, but half his mind is elsewhere. And by evening, he is not tired from life. He is tired from fragmentation. From never being fully anywhere. And yet, the night arrives with the same pattern. The same impulses. The same escape routes. The same silent negotiation. This time won't matter. But it always matters. Not in isolation. In accumulation. And accumulation is where identity is built. There is something people rarely admit about themselves. They are not controlled by big decisions. They are controlled by tiny ones they repeat without noticing. And those tiny decisions form grooves in the mind. Like paths carved in soil. The more you walk them, the easier they become. Until eventually, you are no longer choosing the path. You are being pulled into it. And this is where the real cost begins to reveal itself. Not in dramatic failure, but in subtle erosion. Focus begins to weaken. Confidence becomes unstable. Self-trust starts dissolving. You begin to hesitate more often. Not because you lack knowledge, but because you no longer trust your own follow-through. That is one of the deepest forms of internal loss. When your mind stops believing your promises. At that stage, motivation becomes irrelevant. Because motivation depends on trust. And trust has already been damaged through repetition. Now, pause here mentally for a moment. Because this is where most people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline is force. But force alone cannot override a trained nervous system. You cannot simply try harder against patterns that have been rehearsed for years. Real change begins earlier than effort. It begins with interruption. The interruption of automatic behavior. The moment you notice the impulse without obeying it immediately. That is the first fracture in the pattern. And it feels uncomfortable at first. Because your mind will resist the absence of reaction. It is used to immediate compliance. But discomfort is not a warning sign here. It is recalibration. If you stay inside that moment without acting, something subtle happens. Space appears. And in that space, you are no longer purely reactive. You are present. Most people never experience this space consistently enough to realize how powerful it is. Because they exit it too quickly. They obey the impulse and lose it. Again and again. Now imagine what happens when someone extends that space even slightly. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just slightly longer than before. A second. 2 seconds. 10 seconds. That space becomes the beginning of sovereignty. Not because impulses disappear, but because they lose automatic authority. And once authority weakens, choice becomes possible. There is a quiet shift that begins here. You stop seeing impulses as commands. You start seeing them as signals. And signals can be interpreted, not obeyed. This distinction changes everything internally. Because the moment you stop treating every urge as an instruction, you regain psychological distance. And distance is where clarity lies. Without distance, you are inside the impulse. Inside it, everything feels necessary. Outside it, everything becomes observable. And what is observable can be managed. This is why some people begin to change not through inspiration, but through observation. They stop reacting long enough to see the pattern itself. And once the pattern is seen clearly, it becomes harder to unconsciously repeat. Not impossible, but harder. Now there is something important that must be said clearly. Most people do not lose control because they are weak. They lose control because they never built a system of interruption. No gap between impulse and action. No pause between feeling and response. No separation between identity and reaction. So the nervous system fills that gap automatically. With habit, with repetition, with default behavior. And default behavior always wins when nothing interrupts it. This is why environments matter more than intentions. If your environment constantly triggers impulse, your willpower becomes overloaded. And overloaded willpower eventually collapses into habit. That is not moral failure. It is neurological efficiency. The brain always chooses the path of least resistance unless trained otherwise. Which means discipline is not a personality trait. It is architectural. You build it through structure, through repetition, through interruption, through awareness applied consistently at the exact moment of impulse. Not after, not before, during. That is where power exists. Most people look for transformation in big moments. But transformation is usually decided in invisible ones. The moments no one sees. The moments you almost don't notice yourself. Where you either obey the pattern, or interrupt it, and every interruption is a small vote for a different version of you. Over time, those votes accumulate, and identity begins to shift without dramatic announcement. There is no ceremony, no external confirmation, just gradual change in behavior, attention, and internal stability. You begin to notice something subtle. You are less reactive, less scattered, less dependent on stimulation, not because life changed, because your response to life changed. That is the real hidden cost of impulse control. Not just what you lose when you fail, but what you gain when you begin to interrupt the pattern. A mind that can pause becomes harder to manipulate. A person who can pause becomes harder to predict. And a life that is less predictable by impulse becomes more aligned with intention. Now, before continuing, there is a natural point where attention usually drops. So keep this in mind as you move forward in your own observation of yourself. Every impulse you don't examine becomes a hidden instruction you eventually obey. And most instructions you obey without awareness are not written by you. They are inherited from environment, from repetition, from conditioning, which means part of your current behavior is not chosen. It is inherited motion, and anything inherited can be rewritten. But not by denial, by interruption, and what you interrupt consistently eventually loses authority over you. The question is no longer whether impulses will appear. They will. The question is whether they will continue to decide you, or whether you will begin to stand slightly outside them, long enough to choose something different. And that difference, repeated over time, is where a completely new identity begins to form. One that is not ruled by immediate relief, but by awareness that stays present even when relief is demanding attention. That is where control begins to shift, quietly, without announcement, without permission, and without waiting for readiness. At some point, you start noticing something uncomfortable. Not about the world, about yourself. The same situations keep producing the same outcomes, even when you swear you are trying to change. That is usually the moment people begin to misunderstand their own struggle. They assume they need more motivation, more discipline, more information, but what they actually need is more honesty about what is already happening. Because most behavior problems are not caused by ignorance. They are caused by repeated surrender to a familiar impulse that has become invisible through repetition. You don't experience it as surrender. You experience it as choice. That is the illusion, and it is stable enough to last for years. A person can genuinely believe they are making decisions, while actually following a deeply embedded sequence of reactions. Wait, react, escape, repeat, explain it later, and the explanation always sounds reasonable. That is part of the trap. The mind protects continuity by creating narratives that make repeated failure feel understandable. But understanding without change becomes self-deception. There is a specific moment where this becomes visible. It is usually not dramatic. It happens when you say something like, "I'll start tomorrow," but you don't actually believe tomorrow will be different. You just want to relieve the discomfort of admitting it won't change today. That small internal negotiation is more important than most people realize. Because it reveals something structural about your relationship with impulse. You are not simply failing to act differently. You are actively agreeing with the pattern in the moment it appears. That agreement is subtle, almost invisible, but it is the real mechanism of continuation. Now, here is where things deepen. Most people think impulses are random events. They are not. They are trained responses to internal states. Stress triggers escape. Boredom triggers stimulation. Loneliness triggers connection seeking. Discomfort triggers avoidance. Over time, the mind stops distinguishing between feeling and must respond. And that collapse is what creates compulsive behavior. You stop asking, "Do I need to respond to this?" and start assuming, "I respond because I feel it." That is where control dissolves. Because feeling becomes instruction. But feelings were never designed to be instructions. They are signals, indicators, data points, not commands. However, a reactive mind does not interpret signals. It obeys them. And obedience without reflection is how impulse becomes identity. At first, you still feel like you have choice. But the range of choice slowly narrows. Not because options disappear externally, but because internally, alternatives stop being considered. You no longer ask what else you could do. You only ask how quickly you can relieve what you feel. That shift is subtle but critical. Because it changes the purpose of behavior itself. From intention to escape. From direction to relief. From creation to avoidance. And once a mind becomes relief-oriented, long-term thinking weakens automatically. You begin trading future clarity for immediate comfort. Every single time. Until future clarity no longer feels real enough to compete. There is a reason discipline feels difficult at first. It interrupts relief-seeking patterns. And anything that interrupts relief feels like threat to a nervous system that has adapted to comfort as survival. But here is what most people miss. Discipline is not the opposite of comfort. It is the ability to delay dependence on comfort. That distinction matters. Because you are not removing pleasure from life. You are removing automaticity from your behavior. And automatic behavior is what creates fragility. Let's make this more concrete. Imagine two people exposed to the same impulse. Same temptation. Same stress. Same opportunity to escape. One reacts immediately. The other pauses. Nothing external changes in that moment. But internally, something completely different is happening. The first person strengthens the connection between impulse and action. The second person weakens it. Over time, their identities diverge. Not through dramatic decisions. Through accumulated micro-responses. This is why people underestimate themselves in both directions. They underestimate how much damage small obedience creates. And they underestimate how much strength small resistance builds. Because neither process is immediately visible. But both are cumulative. Now, there is a deeper layer here that most people never consciously articulate. Impulse is not just behavioral. It is emotional architecture. Every repeated impulse reinforces a specific emotional dependency. For example, if you always escape discomfort through distraction, you become dependent on distraction to regulate emotion. If you always seek validation after uncertainty, you become dependent on validation to stabilize identity. If you always numb discomfort through stimulation, you lose tolerance for stillness. And once emotional dependency forms, freedom becomes psychologically uncomfortable. Because freedom requires sitting within regulated internal states. And most people are not trained for that. So they avoid freedom without realizing it. They call it preference. But it is actually dependency. This is why some people feel uneasy when life slows down. When there is silence. When there is no input. When nothing is demanding attention. They don't recognize themselves in that space anymore. Because they have been trained to exist only in reaction. And reaction is noisy. So silence feels foreign, even threatening. This is where many people misunderstand discipline again. They think disciplined people are suppressing desire. But in reality, they are simply not governed by immediate emotional states. Desire still appears, impulse still appears, but it no longer dictates action automatically. There is a gap, and in that gap, identity becomes visible. Now, pay attention here, because this is where transformation becomes real instead of theoretical. You cannot eliminate impulses. You cannot stop emotional reactions from appearing. That is not the goal. The goal is to stop confusing their presence with authority. Just because something arises inside you does not mean it deserves execution. That sentence alone, properly understood, can restructure behavior. But only if it is lived, not just understood. Most people understand this intellectually and still fail behaviorally because they never practice the pause. They jump directly from feeling to action. No space, no observation, no interruption, so the system never updates. And unchanged systems produce unchanged lives. There is a quiet turning point in self-mastery that rarely gets acknowledged. It is when you stop negotiating with impulses entirely. Not through force, through clarity. You begin to see the pattern so consistently that negotiation becomes unnecessary. You already know where it leads. You already recognize the sequence. You already see the outcome forming before it completes. At that stage, resistance becomes simpler. Not easier, simpler. Because there is less internal debate. And less debate means less vulnerability. Now, let's introduce something most people don't like to admit. Many impulses are not about pleasure. They are about identity confirmation. You don't just do things because they feel good. You do them because they confirm a version of you that feels familiar. Even when that version is damaging. That is why people return to patterns they dislike. Because those patterns still feel like them. Breaking impulse often feels like losing identity before it feels like gaining control. That is the psychological cost. You are not only resisting behavior. You are resisting familiarity. And familiarity is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. Stronger than logic. Stronger than intention. Stronger than awareness alone. This is why change feels like internal conflict. Two versions of you are competing. The familiar self that reacts automatically. The emerging self that pauses and chooses. And neither disappears immediately. They overlap, which creates tension. That tension is where most people retreat. They choose the familiar version because it feels stable, even if it is destructive. But the emerging version only strengthens through repetition. So every time you choose it, even briefly, you are training a new default. Not instantly replacing the old one, but weakening its authority. There is a critical insight here. You are not trying to become someone new overnight. You are slowly reducing the automatic power of the old version. That is the real process of transformation. Reduction of automaticity, increase of awareness, expansion of choice, and choice, repeated, becomes identity. Now, before moving forward, there is a practical question forming in the background of everything being said. If impulses are this powerful, how do you actually regain control in real-life situations, not theory? The answer is not dramatic. It is almost disappointingly simple. But simplicity is exactly why it is ignored. You insert interruption, a deliberate pause between feeling and action. Not to suppress the impulse, but to observe it without immediate obedience. That observation changes its authority. Because what is observed without reaction begins to lose unconscious control over you. It becomes information instead of command. And once something becomes information, you can choose what to do with it. But this only works if it is practiced in real moments, not imagined ones. Not later, not ideally, now, in the exact moment impulse appears. That is where control is reclaimed. And every time you do it, you slightly rewrite your internal hierarchy. Impulse moves down, awareness moves up. Over time, this reverses the structure that was previously running automatically. And when that reversal becomes stable, something noticeable happens. Life stops feeling like it is happening to you, and starts feeling like it is being directed by you. Not perfectly, not constantly, but increasingly. And that increase is what most people never allow themselves to experience long enough to recognize. Because the moment resistance appears, they return to automatic behavior. But if you stay with it, even imperfectly, something fundamental shifts. The mind begins to trust you again. Not because you became flawless, but because you became consistent in interruption. And that consistency is where authority returns. Not loudly, quietly, in small decisions no one else sees. But your mind registers everything. And over time, it updates its expectations of you. Which is where identity finally begins to stabilize in a new direction. One that is not built on impulse, but on observation and choice, repeated enough times to become default. There comes a stage where the real problem is no longer impulse itself. It is what impulse has already taken from you without your permission. Not in one event, in accumulation. You notice it in subtle ways first. The inability to stay focused on a single thought without drifting. The discomfort in silence that didn't exist before. The constant pull toward stimulation even when nothing is wrong. The quiet exhaustion that has no clear source. And the most unsettling part is not the behavior. It is how normal it feels. That normalization is the final layer of the pattern. Because once dysfunction feels normal, it stops being questioned. At that point, a person is no longer resisting change. They are simply unaware that change is needed. That is the deepest form of control impulse can achieve. Not force, familiarity. Now, something important becomes visible here if you look closely enough. A life governed by impulse does not collapse suddenly. It fragments, piece by piece. Attention fragments first, then intention, then emotional stability, then identity coherence, until eventually, the person can still function externally, but internally there is no single consistent center guiding behavior. Just reactions layered on reactions. And this is why many people feel internally scattered even when their lives appear organized. Because organization is not the same as sovereignty. You can maintain routines and still lack internal control, if those routines are driven by impulse cycles rather than conscious choice. That distinction is rarely discussed, but it is critical. Now consider something most people avoid admitting. You are not equally yourself at all times. There are moments when you are deliberate, and moments when you are automatic, moments when you are aware, and moments when you are absorbed, moments when you choose, and moments when something in you simply moves before choice appears. Most people live predominantly in the second category without noticing the transition. That is why reflection often feels uncomfortable. Because reflection exposes how little of the day was actually governed consciously. But awareness alone is not enough. Awareness without interruption becomes observation without change. So the question becomes practical. What happens when you finally start interrupting impulse consistently enough that the automatic layer weakens? At first, nothing dramatic changes externally. That is important to understand. Internally, however, something begins to shift that is difficult to describe without experiencing it. There is more space between stimulus and response. More silence inside decisions. More hesitation before reaction becomes action. And that hesitation is not confusion. It is control returning. Because control is not speed. Control is delay with intention. You begin noticing impulses earlier in their formation. Not when they are already overwhelming, but when they are still soft, almost invisible, and at that stage, they are easier to observe without obedience. This is where people often misunderstand progress. They expect impulse to disappear. It does not. What changes is your relationship to its urgency. It feels less mandatory, less immediate, less defining, and that reduction in urgency is everything. Because urgency is what collapses reflection. Now, there is a deeper psychological shift that happens alongside this. When you stop obeying every impulse, you begin to rediscover something that was gradually lost. Self-trust. Not confidence in a motivational sense, but internal reliability. The sense that when you decide something, there is a higher probability you will actually follow through. This sounds simple, but it is foundational. Because without self-trust, every future intention becomes weaker. You stop believing your own future statements. And when that happens, planning becomes symbolic rather than functional. You start making plans you do not expect yourself to keep. That is a quiet form of internal fragmentation. And it is more common than people realize. But as interruption becomes consistent, something reverses. Your mind begins to update its prediction of your behavior. It starts assuming follow-through is possible again. That shift restores internal coherence. And coherence is what makes discipline sustainable. Not intensity, not pressure, coherence. Now, there is another layer here that deserves attention. Many people assume the goal is to become someone who never feels impulse. That is not only unrealistic, it is unnecessary. The goal is not absence of impulse. The goal is absence of automatic obedience. Because impulses will always exist. Human systems generate them constantly. The difference is whether they are commands or data. A controlled mind receives impulse as input. A reactive mind receives impulse as instruction. That is the entire separation. And once you understand that, the entire struggle becomes more precise. You are not fighting yourself. You are changing the status of internal signals. Now, consider what happens in practical life when this begins to stabilize. You start noticing that certain environments no longer pull you as strongly. Certain habits lose momentum faster. Certain emotional states pass without demanding action. And most importantly, you stop feeling as though every internal experience requires external resolution. That is a major shift. Because impulsive living is largely built on the belief that discomfort must be resolved immediately. But controlled living accepts that discomfort can exist without action. That acceptance is not passive. It is stabilizing. It prevents unnecessary behavioral noise. Now, there is something else that quietly changes during this process. Your perception of time. When impulse governs behavior, time feels fragmented. Days blur. Attention jumps. Memory becomes shallow. But when impulse is interrupted consistently, time begins to feel more continuous. You remember your days more clearly. Not because more happened, but because you were more present during what happened. Presence is what creates memory depth. And memory depth is what creates the feeling of a meaningful life. This is one of the hidden costs of impulse-driven living that people rarely articulate. Life does not feel like it was fully lived, only partially experienced, like watching fragments instead of continuity. Now, if you step back and observe the entire structure we've been describing, a pattern becomes clear. Impulse does not just affect behavior. It affects identity stability, focus stability, emotional stability, even narrative stability, the story you tell yourself about your own life. Which is why regaining control is not a small adjustment. It is a restructuring of internal order. But this restructuring does not require perfection. It requires repetition of one simple mechanism. Interruption. Not suppression. Not punishment. Interruption. A moment where automatic sequence is broken long enough for awareness to enter. And that moment, repeated enough times, begins to accumulate power. Because every interruption tells your nervous system something important. You are not required to obey immediately. That message, repeated, gradually rewires response patterns. And as that rewiring progresses, something subtle but profound begins to happen. You stop identifying with every internal state. You begin to separate experience from identity. You are no longer someone who feels this and must act. You are someone who notices what is felt and then decides. That separation is where psychological freedom begins. Now, there is a final layer that often only becomes visible after enough repetition of control. The realization that impulse was never your enemy. It was just unregulated energy. Energy without structure. Energy without hierarchy. Energy without delay. And unregulated energy always produces instability. Not because it is bad. Because it is undirected. So the real transformation is not suppression of energy. It is organization of it. And organization requires a center. A point of reference that is not constantly shifting with every internal wave. That center is awareness that does not immediately react. That observes before it moves. And chooses rather than obeys. Now, at this stage, something becomes clear that cannot be unseen. A person is not defined by what they feel, but by what they consistently do with what they feel. And that gap between feeling and action is where every version of your future is being decided. Not in theory, in real time, in small, unnoticed moments, where impulse appears, and something in you either obeys immediately, or pauses long enough to choose differently. That is the entire structure of control. Simple in description, demanding in execution, but reliable in outcome when repeated. And once that structure begins to stabilize, life stops being a sequence of reactions. It becomes a sequence of decisions. And decisions, unlike impulses, build direction. Direction builds identity, and identity determines everything that follows. Now, there is nothing left to conclude in an abstract sense. Because this is no longer about understanding the pattern. It is about whether the pattern continues through you unchanged, or whether it begins to break at the point of awareness. Every impulse you notice without obeying weakens its authority. Every impulse you obey without noticing strengthens it. That is the entire system. And it is always active. Even now. So the only remaining question is simple. Not philosophical. Practical. When the next impulse appears, will it decide you, or will it simply be observed long enough to lose its automatic power? That is where control begins. And where it either continues, or is reclaimed, silent, consistent, without announcement, just interruption, repeated until identity changes shape.